Tonight we're going to talk about some of the most frustrating roadblocks that you might encounter as you're starting to learn to throw on the wheel. Have you ever struggled with possibly knowing when to move on after you've completed a step of the throwing process? Or are you one of those people that every time you go to cut your pot off, your bottom is just way too thin? Some people, they struggle every time they throw up their pot, they're trying to get a nice straight-walled cylinder and they continue to flare out on them. These can be very challenging and very frustrating roadblocks that people as new potters encounter. I'm going to share with you tonight exactly how we can overcome some of these challenges that everybody faces as they're first starting out. We're going to talk about things like controlling your wheel speed, or using your body leverage and knowing how to compress the clay properly. By the end of this video, I'm going to share with you the secret to resolving some of these common mistakes. All right, let's get started, guys. A lot of people have trouble trying to figure out whether they need to be going faster or slower, or they kind of go back and forth throughout the whole process, and they're really not comfortable at setting a certain speed. So depending on what stage of the throwing process we're in, what I like to do as a good rule of thumb is when I'm first starting to center the clay, I start with the wheel at its full speed. And as I progress through each step of the throwing, I will gradually decrease my speed. And so as I continue to throw and I work through each step and I start pulling it up, I'll slow it down a little bit more. As I'm starting to shape, I'm going to slow it down even more. And then by the end, by the time I'm done, the wheel will be stopped. So that's just a good rule of thumb. You start fast and increasingly decrease your speed. That a lot of people don't necessarily do when they're starting out is they got their ball of clay, they throw it down, right? And it might be relatively in center. You pat it down and they immediately start to center. All right, if you ever have trouble getting your clay centered and you just feel like you're fighting with it all the time, another good thing to do is to kind of pat it in center. So before I even start using water, I'm just going to take my hands and I'll just kind of pat it in the center with the wheel spinning. And this will really help me when I get into the centering process. And as I'm starting to throw, it's really important that I get my body engaged and I'm leveraging my entire body when I'm moving the clay around, right? So I can't be sitting back here disengaged with my arms just out, kind of free flowing. I need to be anchored, and I want to be leaning forward directly over the pot. So no matter what position I am, I'm always tucking my elbows in so that they're anchored, whether they're on my thighs, they're kind of tucked in underneath my arms, and my hands are usually touching in some manner. And this all provides leverage and stability as I'm trying to go through this process. So I'm going to tuck my elbow right into my hip and use my entire body and my legs to push that clay so I can get it nice and centered. I'll actually just use my entire hip right here just to kind of push that clay in and out. So I'm not having to use all my upper body strength. Now another common problem that people have a lot is they keep asking me, well, is the clay centered? Right, so do I continue to keep trying to center it, or do I go ahead and move on to the next step? So what I try to do when I'm centering is I try to limit myself to kind of 4 durations of up-down. So what I mean by that is I'll press in, let the clay rise up, down, let the clay flow out. And I count that as 1. And I do that 4 times. And at that point, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step. If I spend too long trying to get the clay centered and moving the clay up and down, more than likely I've had it centered 3 or 4 times already. But what happens is I release my hands too soon or too quick, it throws it back off balance, or at some point the clay starts to wear out. Because it's every time I'm adding water to it and I'm moving the clay around, it's absorbing that water and that moisture into the clay. And getting the habit of just doing it 4 times and then gently taking my hands away. Now the first couple times you do this, it might not be perfectly centered, but that's okay. If you just get in the habit of forcing yourself to just do it those 4 times, that'll really help you develop what you're looking for into being able to get to center quickly and move on to the next step without allowing too much water to get waterlogged into the pot. Have you ever noticed when you go to open up your clay, you've got this clay flaring out down here at the base? And I bet you when you're done, if you ever cut your pot in half, you've got a lot of thickness left down there at the base. So what I like to do is I try to manage this outside edge of the clay throughout this entire process to make sure that I'm getting the maximum capabilities out of the amount of clay that I'm using. So before I would start, if I didn't get this pushed in during the centering process, I'll just take my finger and hold it here so I get a nice sharp 90-degree angle right here from the back to the side of the clay. That'll really allow me to get underneath that clay as I'm going through and starting to pull the walls up. Alright, so have any of y'all ever gotten your piece out of the bisque kiln and you notice it's got a small crack in the very bottom? So we like to call that an S-crack. And really what it is a compression crack. So what happened is the clay particles at the base weren't compressed properly so that when it goes through the firing process, they vibrated and they started to separate on you. So it's really important to spend some good time after you've opened up the clay to go back and do some good compression to make sure you've got that clay compressed really well. And this doesn't take a whole lot of pressure. It's just a slight pressure going back and forth from center to the right, back to center. And I try to do it at least 3 or 4 times just to ensure that I've got a nice solid compression. And that'll prevent your base from ever cracking again. Another thing I like to do is make sure that I'm keeping watch on my rim and I'm keeping a little bit of compression on it every time I finish a pull. And this allows me to keep it nice and manageable and have a nice solid rim at the top so that everything else is kind of held together. If I allow my rim to get way too thin or it starts to get uneven on me, as I continue to throw, it'll continue to throw off my rhythm as I'm pulling, and it'll cause the top of my pot to be very unstable. So I like to throwing a straight cylinder can be very challenging. My students ask me all the time, they say, how come my pot keeps flaring out on me? What do I need to do? How can I get it to go straight up? How can I get that height that I'm looking for? And this is something that a lot of potters struggle with, even potters that have been doing this for a long time. So what I'm going to do every time I do a pull, when I'm trying to throw something straight, is I always want to keep it slightly pitched in. And that'll help keep it nice and controlled all the way until the end, until I go to straighten it up. And the way I do that is I'll keep my inside hand slightly below my outside hand as I'm going to pull. Now what gets a lot of people is when they go and put their hands in position, right? Their bottom hand starts out above their outside hand because of the base of the pot. So what you have to do is you have to go into the bottom of the piece, lift this outside hand up slightly, then once it's slightly above the inside hand, then you start to lift. So that's really key. And the last key point is it's really important that your face is directly over the line that you're pulling. Because naturally your hands are going to pull towards your face. They're pulling towards your body, right? So if you're leaned over like this, you're going to pull this way. If you're leaned back this way, you're going to pull this way. So you want to be directly over the line at which you want the clay to go. So if I'm pulling straight up, my eyesight, my head, my body alignment is all going to be in line with that line that I'm trying to pull. Does that make sense? It's really important. That one fact alone will help you tremendously. I encourage you to try it next time you're sitting down at the wheel. So again, start at the base. My outside finger is below my inside finger. I'm going to lift it just a little bit. All right, now it's above my inside hand. And then I'm going to lift straight up, nice and slow. Notice I'm directly over top of the pot. Majority of the pressure is from my outside hand. And that allows me to get it nice and straight. One thing I tell all the people I work with a lot is do not stop your wheel until you're done with the throwing process. Now this is something not a lot of people do, but I found it to be extremely helpful, mainly for the reason of the clay has memory, right? So the clay is elastic and it remembers its last position. So if I've got the wheel spinning and I'm going and I accidentally hit it, it's a lot easier. I can gently just put my fingers back in place and the clay will want to go right back to where it was because of the memory. But if I've got the wheel stopped and I hit into it, well, now it makes it a lot more difficult. I've made a lot more pronounced mark onto the piece. So by keeping the wheel spinning at all times, it helps eliminate the risk of accidentally messing up the piece that I've been working so hard on. And all I'm doing here is just, I'm not really pulling the clay at all. I'm just trying to get the clay back in center and realign everything so that the clay redefines its memory of where it was. And you notice I'm not soaking it full of water. I don't want the clay to get waterlogged. It's just wet enough to where my fingers will glide on it. Now I'm going to go back with my final shape to try to get it nice and straight. And this is, I just chose this rib because almost everybody has one of these little metal kidney ribs. I use a more stiffer rib when I'm doing this, but this will work. The key to using a rib is I'm going to set the rib at the outside position to where I want the clay to be. And I'm going to use my inside hand to push the clay to that point, right? So the rib stays steady, the clay goes to the rib. Very important. Hold the rib steady, nice and gently push the clay to the rib, starting at the base. Once the clay is touching the rib, I'm going to slowly lift up. All right, last tip I'm going to leave you with. All right, so remember at the beginning I was talking about the clear flaring out down here? If you notice, I've been able to keep that managed throughout this entire process. So I've still got this nice 90-degree angle. This will really help you a lot. Now, if you don't have this and the clear is still flaring out down here, that's okay. You're just going to want to take your finger, gently hold it here, kind of clean it up to get it nice and flat. And then I believe it's always really important to go ahead and finish the base of your pot on the wheel. This really helps for a lot of reasons. Even if I'm going to go trim it, which most of us will trim the pots later on after they've dried to leather hard. Even if I'm going to do that, by going ahead and putting a foot on the pot now, it makes trimming a lot easier. So I'm going to take my tool, hold it at an angle, and gently cut into the base of the pot. When I do this, I want to make sure that I'm really getting up underneath that piece. So you'll notice I'm going about this far into the bottom of that pot so that it really lifts up off of the back. And then I'll take my sponge and I'm going to get it underneath that piece and then take this top finger and get on top of it as well. So that way I've got some nice compression on the bottom and top of that indentation that I've made. And then I just let the wheel do the work. Now you've noticed I've got a nice foot already. And I'll probably trim that off later on when I go to start trimming it. But at least it's got a nice stable base, so I don't have to worry about when I flip this pot over there being a lot of chatter because the bottom's uneven or there's all this excess that I've got to cut off. It just makes for a lot easier and smoother process. And most of us don't really like trimming anyway, so at least I don't. Maybe trimming is your favorite thing. I'm not too fond of trimming. So I like to go ahead and finish the foot as soon as possible. All right, let's go ahead and cut it in half and see how we did. All right, so this is what we're looking for, guys. So you'll notice I've got a nice angle right here, nice and flat on the outside. My base, nice thickness, and it matches the walls. This takes a lot of practice. Unfortunately, there's no magical solution to being able to do this right away. The only way you're going to be able to get to a place where you can throw pots like this is by repetition. The more you do it, the easier it'll get. The more you try out some of these things we've talked about tonight, the more comfortable you'll become, the more muscle memory you'll build in your arms and in your mind, to a point where you can do this blindfolded. You don't even have to think about it anymore. But again, the only way to do that is by repetition. And one of the best challenges that I've ever come across that I recommend to all my students that are starting to get serious about this and really want to learn is the 100 mug challenge. So I challenge you, see if you can sit down in one sitting and make 100 mugs without getting up. Can you do it? All right, guys, I hope y'all learned something tonight. Until next time, Harry the Potter, signing out.